All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are currently reading Angela Y. Davis, Women, Race, and Class. We are on Chapter 2, top of page 40. Of all the pioneering women abolitionists, it was the Grimke sisters from South Carolina, Sarah and Angelina, who most consistently linked the issue of slavery to the oppression of women. From the beginning of their tumultuous lecturing career, they were compelled to defend their rights as women to be public advocates of abolition, and by implication to defend the rights of all women to register publicly their opposition to slavery. Born into a South Carolina slaveholding family, the Grimke sisters developed a passionate abhorrence of the, quote, peculiar institution, end quote, and decided, as adults, to move north. Joining the abolitionist effort in 1836, they began to lecture in New England about their own lives and their daily encounters with the untold evils of slavery. Although the gatherings were sponsored by the female anti-slavery societies, increasing numbers of men began to attend. Quote, gentlemen, hearing of their eloquence and power, soon began timidly to slip into the back seats, end quote. These assemblies were unprecedented, for no other women had ever addressed mixed audiences on such a regular basis without facing derogatory cries and disruptive jeers hurled by men who felt that public speaking should be an exclusively male activity. While the men attending the Grimke's meetings were undoubtedly eager to learn from the women's experiences, the sisters were vengefully attacked by other male forces. The most devastating attack came from religious quarters. On July 28, 1837, the Council of Congregationalist Ministers of Massachusetts issued a pastoral letter severely chastising them for engaging in activities which subverted women's divinely ordained role. Quote, the power of woman is her dependence, flowing from the consciousness of that weakness which God has given her for her protection. End quote. According to the ministers, the Grimke's actions had created, quote, dangers which at present threaten the female character with widespread and permanent injury, end quote. Moreover, quote, we appreciate the uninstantaneous prayers of women in advancing the cause of religion. But when she assumes the place and tone of man as a public reformer, she yields the power which God has given her for her protection, and her character becomes unnatural. If the vine, whose strength and beauty is to lean on the trellis work and half conceal its cluster, thinks to assume the independence and overshadowing nature of the elm, it will not only cease to bear fruit, but fall in shame and dishonor into the dust. End quote. Framed by the largest Protestant denomination in Massachusetts, this pastoral letter had immense repercussions. If the ministers were correct, then Sarah and Angelina Grimke were committing the worst of all possible sins. They were challenging God's will. The echoes of this assault did not begin to fade until the Grimkes finally decided to terminate their lecturing career. And as we turn, this isn't really a break in the chapter or a change of theme, but I do want to just continue to point out some of the consistent themes in this, and with some of the other things that we've also read and talked about on some of these episodes, and that is just the power of speech, the power of talking, the power of bringing awareness to an issue, and how when you do those things, how those things, that the regularity of doing those things begins to change the consciousness of the society, begins to change the consciousness of communities. And that's not something that happens just from what may be deemed as success. You know, somebody might not deem it a success that the Grimke sisters had to cease their lecturing because of the repression that they dealt with. But one of the things that is important to point out in all of these issues is that we are all part of struggling in a moment or resisting in a moment. And so it's not necessarily about winning your particular battle or the particular war that you are in, as much as it is about being a piece of the greater battle, the piece of the greater war, and making sure that there is a struggle that's taking place. And so I think that, again, we see how repression is in its own way a reward. Repression is in its own way a sign of achievement. And again, we see the commonality of the repression of women and the repression that was the repression for women for speaking out about issues, and also the repression that was dealt to people who were speaking out about particular issues, the specific issue of slavery. Neither Sarah nor Angelina had originally been concerned, at least not expressly, about questioning the social inequality of women. Their main priority had been to expose the inhuman and immoral essence of the slavery system and the special responsibility women bore for its perpetuation. But once the male supremacist attacks against them were unleashed, they realized that unless they defended themselves as women and the rights of women in general, they would be forever barred from the campaign to free the slaves. The more powerful order of the two, Angelina Grimke, challenged this assault on women in her lectures. Sarah, who was the theoretical genius, began a series of letters on the equality of the sexes and the condition of women. Completed in 1838, Sarah Grimke's, quote, letter on the equality of the sexes, end quote, contained one of the first extensive analyses of the status of women authored by a woman in the United States. Setting down her ideas 6 years before the publication of Margaret Fuller's well-known treatise on women, Sarah disputed the assumption that inequality between the sexes was commanded by God. Quote, men and women were created equal. They are both moral and accountable human beings. End quote. She directly contested the ministers' charge that women who seek to give leadership to social reform movements were unnatural, insisting instead that, quote, whatever is right for man is right for woman. End quote. The writings and lectures of these two outstanding sisters were enthusiastically received by many of the women who were active in the female anti-slavery movement. But some of the leading men in the abolitionist campaign claimed that the issues of women's rights would confuse and alienate those who were solely concerned about the defeat of slavery. Angelina's early response spelled out her and her sisters' understanding of the strong threads tying women's rights to abolitionism. Quote, we cannot push abolitionism forward with all our might until we take up the stumbling block out of the road. To meet this question may appear to be turning out of the road. It is not. We must meet it and meet it now. Why, my dear brothers, can you not see the deep-laid scheme of the clergy against us as lecturers? If we surrender the right to speak in public this year, we must surrender the right to petition next year, and the right to write the year after that, and so on. What then can woman do for the slave when she herself is under the feet of man and shamed into silence? End quote. An entire decade before white women's mass opposition to the ideology of male supremacy received its organizational expression, the Grimke sisters urged women to resist the destiny of passivity and dependence which society had imposed upon them in order to take their rightful place in the struggle for justice and human rights. Angelina's 1837 appeal to the women of the nominally free states forcefully argues this point. Quote, it is related of Bonaparte that he one day rebuked a French lady for busying herself with politics. Quote, sire, end quote, replied she, quote, in a country where women are put to death, it is very natural that women should wish to know the reason why, end quote. And, dear sisters, in a country where women are degraded and brutalized, and where their exposed persons bleed under the lash, where they are sold in the shambles of, quote, Negro brokers, end quote, robbed of their hard earnings, torn from their husbands, and forcibly plundered of their virtue and their offspring, surely in such a country, it is very natural that women should wish to know, quote, the reason why, end quote, especially when these outrages of blood and nameless horror are practiced in violation of the principles of our Constitution. We do not, then, and cannot concede the position that because this is a political subject, women ought to fold their hands in idleness and close their eyes and ears to the horrible things that are practiced in our land. The denial of our duty to act is a bold denial of our right to act. And if we have no right to act, then they may well be termed, quote, the white slaves of the North, end quote. For like our brethren in bonds, we must seal our lips in silence and despair. End quote. The above passage is also an illustration of the Grimke sisters' insistence that white women in the North and South acknowledge the special bond linking them with black women who suffered the pain of slavery. Again, quote, "They are our country women. They are our sisters. And to us, as women, they have a right to look for sympathy with their sorrows and effort and prayer for their rescue." End quote. Quote, "The question of equality for women," end quote, as Eleanor Flexner put it, was not, quote, "a matter of abstract justice," end quote, for the Grimkes, quote, "but of enabling women to join in an urgent task," end quote. Since the abolition of slavery was the most pressing political necessity of the times, they urged women to join in that struggle with the understanding that their own oppression was nurtured and perpetuated by the continued existence of the slave system. Because the Grimke sisters had such a profound consciousness of their inseparability of the fight for black liberation and the fight for women's liberation, they were never caught in the ideological snare of insisting that one struggle was absolutely more important than the other. They recognized the dialectical character of the relationship between the two causes. More than any other women in the campaign against slavery, the Grimkes urged the constant inclusion of the issue of women's rights. At the same time, they argued that women can never achieve their freedom independently of black people. Quote, I want to be identified with the Negro," end quote, said Angelina to a convention of patriotic women supporting the Civil War effort in 1863. Quote, "Until he gets his rights, we shall never have ours," end quote. Prudence Kendall had risked her life in defense of black children's rights to education. If her stand contained the promise of a fruitful and powerful alliance, bringing black people and women together in order to realize their common dream of liberation, then the analysis presented by Sarah and Angelina Grimke was the most profound and most moving theoretical expression of that promise of unity. And that brings us to the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. I'm going to take a moment to pause here in this segment, but then I'm going to begin back here again, and I'm going to do a reflection on that chapter. Okay. We finished that segment up. The ending of that segment was just the finalization of the second chapter of Angela Davis's book, Women, Race, and Class. So let's just pick back up at the beginning of the third chapter, and then I'll speak about some of the things presented in this third chapter here as we read along. Chapter 3, Class and Race in the Early Women's Rights Campaign. As Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wended their way arm in arm down Great Queen Street that night, reviewing the exciting scenes of the day, they agreed to hold a women's rights convention on their return to America, as the men to whom they had just listened had manifested their great need of some education on that question. Thus, the missionary work for the emancipation of woman in, quote, the land of the free and the home of the brave, end quote, was then and there inaugurated. This conversation, which took place in London on the opening day of the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention, is frequently assumed to contain the real story behind the birth of the organized women's movement in the United States. As such, it has acquired a somewhat legendary significance. And like most legends, the truth it presumes to embody is far less unequivocal than it appears. This anecdote and its surrounding circumstances have been made the basis of a popular interpretation of the women's rights movement as having been primarily inspired, or rather provoked, by the insufferable male supremacy within the anti-slavery campaign. No doubt, the U.S. women who had expected to participate in the London conference were quite furious when they found themselves excluded by majority vote, quote, fenced off behind a bar and a curtain similar to those used in churches to screen the choir from public gaze, end quote. Lucretia Mott, like the other women officially representing the American Anti-Slavery Society, have further cause for anger and indignation. For she had just recently emerged from a turbulent struggle around the issue of female abolitionists' rights to participate on a basis of full equality in the work of the Anti-Slavery Society. Yet for a woman who had been excluded from membership in the society some 7 years previously, this was no new experience. If she was indeed inspired to fight for women's rights by the London events, by the fact that, as two contemporary feminist authors put it, quote, the leading male radicals, those most concerned with social inequalities, also discriminate against women, end quote, it was an inspiration that had struck her long before 1840. Unlike Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not an experienced political activist when the London Convention took place. Accompanying her husband of only several weeks on what she called their, quote, wedding journey, end quote, she was attending her first anti-slavery meeting not as a delegate, but, rather, as the wife of an abolitionist leader. Mrs. Stanton was thus somewhat handicapped, lacking the perspective forged by years of struggle in defense of women's rights to contribute to the anti-slavery cause. When she wrote, along with Susan B. Anthony in their History of Women's Suffrage, that during her conversation in 1840 with Lucretia Mott, quote, a missionary work for the emancipation of women was then and there inaugurated, end quote, her remarks did not account for the accumulated lessons wrought by almost a decade during which abolitionist women had battled for their political emancipation as women. Although they were defeated at the London Convention, the abolitionist women did discover evidence that their past struggles had achieved a few positive results, for they were supported by some of the male anti-slavery leaders who opposed the move to exclude them. William Lloyd Garrison, quote, brave, noble Garrison, end quote, who arrived too late to participate in the debate, refused to take his seat, remaining during the entire 10-day convention, quote, a silent spectator in the gallery, end quote. According to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's account, Nathaniel P. Rogers of Concord, New Hampshire, was the only other male abolitionist who joined the women in the gallery. While the black abolitionist Charles Riemann is not mentioned in Stanton's description of the events is rather puzzling. He was also, as he himself wrote in an article published in The Liberator, quote, a silent listener, end quote. Charles Riemann wrote that he experienced one of the few great disappointments of his life when he discovered, upon his arrival, that the women had been excluded from the convention floor. He had good reason to feel distressed, for his own travel expenses had been paid by several women's groups. Quote, I was almost entirely indebted to the kind and generous members of the Bangor Female Anti-Slavery Society, the Portland Sewing Circle, and the Newport Young Ladies' Juvenile Anti-Slavery Society for aid in visiting this country, end quote. Riemann felt compelled to refuse his seat in the convention because he could not otherwise be the, quote, honored representative of the three female associations, at once most praiseworthy in their object and efficient in this cooperation, end quote. Not all of the men, therefore, were the, quote, bigoted abolitionists, end quote, to whom Stanton refers in her historical account. At least some of them had learned to detect and challenge the injustices of male supremacy. Whereas Elizabeth Cady Stanton's interest in abolitionism was quite recent, she had conducted a personal fight against sexism throughout her youth. Encouraged by her father, a wealthy and unabashedly conservative judge, she had defied orthodoxy in her studies as well as in her leisure activities. She studied Greek and mathematics and learned horseback riding, all of which were generally barred to girls. At age 16, Elizabeth was the only girl in her high school graduating class. Before her marriage, the young Stanton passed much of her time with her father and had even begun to study the law seriously under his guidance. By 1848, Stanton was a full-time housewife and mother. Living with her husband in Seneca Falls, New York, she was often unable to hire servants because they were so scarce in that area. Her own anticlimactic and frustrating life made her especially sensitive to the middle-class white woman's predicament. In explaining her decision to contact Lucretia Mott, whom she had not seen for 8 years, she mentioned her domestic situation first among her several motives for issuing a call to a women's convention. Quote, the general discontent I felt with woman's portion as wife, mother, housekeeper, physician, and spiritual guide, and the wearied, anxious look of the majority of women impressed me with a strong feeling that some active measures should be taken to remedy the wrongs of society in general and of women in particular. My experiences at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, all I had read of the legal status of women, and the oppression I saw everywhere, together swept across my soul, intensified now by many personal experiences. It seemed as if all the elements had conspired to impel me to some onward step. I could not see what to do or where to begin. My only thought was a public meeting for protest and discussion." End quote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's life exhibited all the basic elements in their most contradictory form of the middle-class woman's dilemma. Her diligent efforts to achieve excellence in her studies, the knowledge she had gained as a law student, and all the other ways she had cultivated her intellectual powers, all this had come to naught. Marriage and motherhood precluded the achievement of the goals she had set forth for herself as a single woman. Moreover, her involvement in the abolitionist movement during the years following the London Convention had taught her that it was possible to organize a political challenge to oppression. Many of the women who had answered the call to attend the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls were becoming conscious of the similar contradictions in their lives and had likewise seen, from the example of the anti-slavery struggle, that it was possible to fight for equality. And so I want to take a stopping and a changing of themes within this chapter. The first thing that stands out to me from the passages we just read is the acts of solidarity that you hear about these three specific men taking during this anti-slavery convention that was going on. And I think that type of act of solidarity, the women were essentially segregated off from the men and not allowed to talk, and were designated as only exhibitors. And so three men specifically chose to be exhibitors as well. And I think the one that has the most layers to it is the black man Riemann, who chose to not speak because of the fact that the way he had got there, had been through women and finances that women abolitionist movements had put up. And so he felt that he cannot then be a voice or advocate for those people and for those organizations that had helped him get there if those organizations, the people who would be in them, would be subjugated to not being able to speak and not being able to have a voice. And so he chose to not speak and he chose to not have a voice. And I think that one of the things that has been prevalent through these first three chapters has been the solidarity between white women and black people during this period of time because of the commonality of the repression that they were both facing. And I think that is something that all subjugated groups and marginalized groups, we must begin to dissect how we are all intertwined when it comes to specifically what we're here for, issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Understand the intersectionalities that exist between our separate groups, our separate collectives, our separate communities. So that way, when moments of opportunity for solidarity arise, not only can we take them, but we can understand the importance of taking them. That we can understand why at this meeting that's about slavery, that's about the abolition of slavery, that this is the perfect time for a black person who knows these issues intimately well to be in solidarity with women who are being subjugated within this meeting. And I think that one of the other things that's important about this specific thing that is pointed out is the reminder that an individual action has ripple effects throughout history and has ripple effects throughout time. And so maybe in a moment being only two of 200 or 300 or however many people to not do something, to abstain from something, does not seem like a monumental action then and there. But what happens is when you are on the right side of history, the ripple effects changes the power in doing something. And you in the present, sometimes being the one person to abstain or the two people to abstain or being the minority to abstain, it feels as if you are in a losing battle, or it feels as if you have failed somehow, or you feel the repression a little heavier. But as when you are on the right side of history, as time goes on, that that burden alleviates and it shifts from you to the majority. And so when you look back in time, the minority who were against slavery are now on the right side of history, and the burden of that issue shifts from the people who abstained from it to the people who engaged in it. And the same thing with Jim Crow segregation. The same thing will be true with police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And we see the same thing being true here, where in this moment, these three people not speaking, it may have felt as if they lost more than they gained. But as history goes on and as time goes on, it's clear that the loudest voices that were in that room were the voices that chose to not speak. And here, that gets us here. Well, let's knock out one more little segment real quick, and then we'll end this episode. Okay, 1 second. Get back on the page. Okay. As the Seneca Falls Convention was being planned, Elizabeth Cady Stanton proposed a resolution which appeared too radical even to her co-conventioner, Lucretia Mott. Although Mrs. Mott's experience in the anti-slavery movement has certainly persuaded her that women urgently needed to exercise political power, she opposed the introduction of a resolution on women's suffrage. Such a move would be interpreted as an absurd and outrageous, she thought, and would consequently undermine the importance of the meeting. Stanton's husband also opposed the raising of the suffrage issue and kept his promise to leave town if she insisted on presenting the resolution. Frederick Douglass was the only prominent figure who agreed that the convention should call for women's right to vote. Several years before the Seneca Falls meeting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had firmly convinced Frederick Douglass that the vote should be extended to women. Quote, I could not meet her argument except with the shallow plea of, quote, custom, end quote, natural division of duties, end quote, indelicacy of women's taking part in politics, end quote, the common talk of woman's fear, end quote, and the like, all of which that able woman who was then no less, what up? Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. This fucking Christmas shit crazy. Okay, let me try to read this one more time. Quote, I cannot meet her arguments except with the shallow plea of custom, natural division of duties, indelicacy of women's taking part in politics, the common talk of woman's fear, and the like, all of which that able woman, who was then no less logical than now, brushed away by those arguments which she has so often and effectively used since, and which no man has successfully refuted. If intelligence is the only true and rational basis of government, it follows that that is the best government which draws its life and power from the largest sources of wisdom, energy, and goodness at its command. End quote. Among the approximately 300 women and men attending the Seneca Falls Convention, the issue of electoral power for women was the only major point of contention. The suffrage resolution alone was not unanimously endorsed. That the controversial proposal was presented at all, however, was due to Frederick Douglass's willingness to second Stanton's motion and to employ his oratorical abilities in defense of women's right to vote. During those early days, when women's rights was not yet a legitimate cause, when women's suffrage was unfamiliar and unpopular as a demand, Frederick Douglass publicly, what up, Merry Christmas, take it easy. This shit throwing off the whole end of this reading. During those early days, when women's rights was not yet a legitimate cause, when women's suffrage was unfamiliar and unpopular as a demand, Frederick Douglass publicly agitated for the political equality of women. In the immediate aftermath of the Seneca Falls Convention, he published an editorial in his newspaper, the North Star, entitled, quote, The Rights of Women, end quote. Its content was quite radical for the times. Quote, in respect to political rights, we hold women to be justly entitled to all we claim for men. We go further and express our conviction that all political rights which it is expedient for men to exercise, it is equally so for women. All that distinguishes man as an intelligent and accountable being is equally true of woman, And if that government only is just which governs by the free consent of the governed, there can be no reason in the world for denying to woman the exercise of the elective franchise or a hand in making and administering the law of the land. End quote. Frederick Douglass was also responsible for officially introducing the issue of women's rights to the Black liberation movement, where it was enthusiastically welcomed. As S.J. Walker points out, Douglass spoke out at the National Convention of Colored Freedmen that was held in Cleveland, Ohio, around the time of the Seneca Falls meeting, saying, quote, he succeeded in amending a resolution defining delegates so that it would be understood to include women, an amendment that was carried with 3 cheers for women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton devoted expressions of praise to Douglass for his steadfast defense of the Seneca Falls Convention in the face of the widespread ridicule voiced in the press. Quote, so pronounced was the popular voice against us, in the parlor, press, and pulpit, that most of the ladies who had attended the convention and signed the declaration, one by one withdrew their names and influence and joined our persecutors. Our friends gave us the cold shoulder and felt themselves disgraced by the whole proceeding. End quote. The uproar did not dissuade Douglass, nor did it achieve its goal of nipping the battle for women's rights in the bud. Parlor, press, and pulpit, try as they might, could not reverse this trend. Only 1 month passed before another convention took place in Rochester, New York, whose daring innovation and precedent for future meetings was a female presiding officer. Frederick Douglass again manifested his loyalty to his sisters by arguing once more for the suffrage resolution, which passed in Rochester by a much larger margin than at Seneca Falls. The advocacy of women's rights cannot be forbidden. Not yet acceptable to the makers of public opinion, the issue of women's equality, now embodied in an embryonic movement, supported by black people who were fighting for their own freedom, established itself as an indelible element of public life in the United States. But what was it all about? How was the question of women's equality defined other than by the suffrage issue which had prompted the derogatory publicity about the Seneca Falls Convention? Were the grievances outlined in the Declaration of Sentiments and the demands put forth in the resolutions truly reflective of the problems and needs of the women of the United States? The emphatic focus of the Seneca Falls Declaration was the institution of marriage and its many injurious effects on women. Marriage robbed women of their property rights, making wives economically, as well as morally, dependent on their husbands. Demanding absolute obedience from wives, the institution of marriage gave husbands the right to punish their wives, and what is more, the laws of separation and divorce were almost entirely based on male supremacy. As a result of women's inferior status within marriage, the Seneca Falls Declaration argued they suffered inequalities in educational institutions as well as in the professions. Quote, profitable employments and, quote, all avenues to wealth and distinction, end quote, such as medicine, law, and theology, were absolutely inaccessible to women. The Declaration concludes its list of grievances with an evocation of women's mental and psychological dependence, which has left them with little, quote, confidence and self-respect, end quote. And, hold on one second. And then, we're going to stop this episode right here. We're a little bit over our 30-minute mark. But I think one of the things I want to point out for the last passage we read is an importance on having a full perspective of moments in history. And I think Frederick Douglass is heavily spoken about and talked about in mainstream education and in mainstream thought and in mainstream history as a key component to the Black liberation struggle and to the abolitionist struggle. However, you do not hear a lot about his contributions to women's suffrage, his contributions to the women's liberation struggle, and I think that does the negative job of taking away an aspect of intersectionality that is important for people to learn about. It takes away an aspect of solidarity that is important for people to learn about, and it makes it seem as if these people who are leaders of their times, these people who are important to their times, who help to vocalize and orate issues of their times and shift the consciousness of the society, when you take away pieces of their ideology or pieces of their philosophy, it does the job of and whitewashing isn't really the right word for this specific thing. It does the job of rewriting history. And I think that anytime history is rewritten to remove a piece of intersectionality or to remove a piece of solidarity, that is done in the effort to continue division, to continue divisiveness. And so I think that it's important for young black boys growing up who will idolize or look up to Frederick Douglass or find some type of voice in Frederick Douglass or find themselves in some of the beliefs of Frederick Douglass, to also know about the part of Frederick Douglass that wanted women to be equal, that wanted that, and not just wanted it as if it was organic or natural to him, but as is pointed out in here, his belief system was challenged by a woman, and in that challenging, he came to agree with her belief. He came to understand something that was outside of what was normal thought for that time period. And so I think that it's important for us to understand the complexities of these historical figures of the past and understand the solidarity and the intersectionality these figures of the past held. And I think that, again, it's just important to understand the intersectionality and commonalities that these movements of the past have held. So as we are grasping back in the present to be inspired or be motivated or find some type of guidance from these movements of the past, we're also bringing in the some of the positive characteristics of those movements, such as intersectionality. And so I hope that one of the things people take away from, and this is something that I have done, even though our specific struggle is a struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, I have learned to be able to articulate how many other specific struggles are encapsulated in that and how many struggles outside of that have interconnectedness with these struggles. And I think that once we can get onto a page of that being a commonality where you can have a conversation about police terrorism and you can be able to weave how it ties into 4 or 5 other social issues, we will get to the place of building up those united fronts that we need to destroy some of these things. So I want to thank people for taking the time to tune into this episode. This is a little longer episode than some of the previous ones, but I think that it was necessary. We want to try to get through this book in maybe 2.5 to 3 weeks at the most. So some of these episodes may be a little bit longer. Please go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily if you haven't at this point. Like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, and be on the lookout for tomorrow's episode of Rockford Reading Daily. All right, we outside.